The sun rose that morning with an eerie red hue, casting long, blood-tinged shadows over the cracked earth of Uluma. The wind whispered dry secrets through the dead maize fields, the brittle stalks rustling like bones. Nothing had grown in 3 years. Not a single yam, not a single cassava root, not even the stubborn weeds that used to claim corners of the village paths. The riverbed was a scar of dust. The sky was empty, pale, and cruel. The people were thinner now, faces sunken, cheeks hollow, eyes sun-dried and shifty. And when people begin to waste away, so too does their faith. They had prayed. Oh, how they had prayed, knees pressed into baked earth until they bled, voices hoarse from crying out to gods whose names had been passed down since the world was young. The shrines were full of offerings, calabashes of palm wine, feathers of sacrificed birds, even the teeth of children who had died. Still, the skies did not weep. The gods did not speak. And so the people of Uluma turned to fear. Desperation, in time, becomes its own kind of belief. The elders, wrinkled men with shaking hands and hollow hearts, sat in a circle beneath the sacred Irako tree and whispered of old curses. Of signs. Of sins buried in plain sight. They looked toward the outskirts of the village, toward a lonely mud hut where a girl lived alone, silent, and always watching. Amara. The rainmaker's daughter. The girl with the black eyes and the red mark behind her left ear. The girl born on the night when the moon turned red and the dogs refused to howl. They remembered too much. They remembered how her mother, Abony, had once stood in the market square and screamed that the gods were liars. How, after Amara's birth, birds flew backward for 3 days. How milk soured in the breasts of nursing women when the child passed. How the twins born the following year came out conjoined at the chest, breathing as one, dying as two. Then came the voices in the night, murmurs that slithered beneath hut doors, laughter that didn't belong to any mouth. The people began to avoid Amara. Then they began to fear her. When her father fell ill and bled from his eyes, they called it justice. When her mother walked into the forest one night and never returned, they called it fate. And now, 3 years without rain? That was confirmation. So they gathered before dawn. They moved in silence, torches in hand, as though noise might summon something worse than the drought. Mothers left cooking fires untended. Fathers led their sons, not explaining why. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes and followed, wide-eyed and shivering, as if drawn by something they didn't understand. They walked toward the edge of the village, past the bones of goats, past the cracked totems of forgotten spirits, until they reached the hut. Amara stood at the doorway. She was barefoot, as always, feet calloused by stone and time. Her dress was threadbare, the color of old clay. In her hands, she held a small carved doll, a faceless thing with arms outstretched and a red thread wound tightly around its neck. Her face was expressionless, as if she had been expecting them. As if she had already lived this moment 1,000 times in her dreams. The crowd did not speak. Not even the chief, Doka, who usually roared like thunder. The priestess stepped forward, her white robes smeared with soot and sweat, her voice trembling as she chanted. Her words curled through the air like smoke, heavy with age and fear. She knelt before Amara, tied red cowrie shells to the girl's wrists, whispering, "To bind your soul." She smeared ash across Amara's cheeks, saying, "To hide your shadow." She spit 3 times into the dirt and drew a circle around the child's feet. Amara did not flinch. She did not cry. Her eyes, dark and still, scanned the faces of her neighbors, those who had once held her as a baby, those who had shared mangoes with her under the sun. None of them met her gaze. Their eyes were downcast, fixed on their own feet, as though ashamed. Or afraid of what they might see in hers. "Bring her," the chief finally said. 2 men stepped forward, men whose hands had once lifted her onto their shoulders during festivals. They took her arms gently but firmly. She did not resist. The doll slipped from her fingers and landed in the dirt. No one picked it up. The procession began. Through the silent village they walked, Amara in the center, flanked by guilt and fear. The wind had died completely now. Even the birds watched without singing. Smoke from cooking fires curled upward like mourners' veils. A child sobbed quietly. Her mother shushed her. The forest loomed ahead. At its edge stood the hut, a structure older than memory, built from sacred wood that the elders claimed had once bled when cut. Salt had been poured around its base in a perfect circle. Charms and bones hung from its eaves. No one lived there. No one dared. It had always been reserved for rituals, offerings, exiles, things that could not be explained or forgiven. Now it was to be a prison. A cage for something they feared would become worse if left to roam free. The priestess stood by the door and uttered the sealing prayer. The words were jagged, foreign. Some swore they came from a time before language. The shells on Amara's wrists vibrated. A sudden gust of wind blew, lifting her hair from her shoulders. Leaves swirled at her feet, then stilled. The chief raised his hand. 7 years, he said. 7 years, and the curse will leave us. They pushed her inside. She did not scream. She did not beg. The door slammed shut. A heavy wooden bar fell across it. Nails were hammered in. A charm of black feathers and blood was tied to the latch. The people turned away. Some wept. Others sighed in relief. A few stared at their hands, wondering if they would be clean again. A child cried, her wail echoing through the clearing. Then silence. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. But deep in the forest, beyond the reach of men, something stirred. Something ancient. Something patient. Something that had been waiting for this moment. In the shadows between the trees, eyes opened, glowing, watching. And slowly, ever so slowly, they began to smile. Send the next part whenever you're ready. The hut breathed. Not like a living thing, not in the way lungs do, but in the way something old and bound does, soft groans in the walls, whispers in the wood, a pulse behind the silence. Amara sat in the center of it, knees pulled to her chest, the shaft of light above casting a single golden beam onto the earth and floor. Dust swirled in it like tiny ghosts. The rest of the room was cloaked in shadows so deep they looked like they were swallowing color. At first, she did not cry. She had expected pain. She had expected the dark. But not this silence. Not this terrible, dense stillness that curled inside her belly and made her thoughts echo too loudly in her skull. She thought of her mother. Her smile, her scent, the songs she sang. Then she thought of her leaving. The back of her figure, walking into the forest and never looking back. That was the last clear memory. After that, nothing but whispers and pity. The first day passed with aching hunger. By evening, her stomach clawed itself. She sucked on her own knuckles, then dirt, then nothing. On the second day, the thirst came. Her tongue swelled. Her lips cracked. She tried to catch the drops of dew from the thatched roof with her tongue when the morning light came. She prayed. She called for her mother. For her father. Even for the priestess. No one came. By the fourth day, her head felt like it floated above her body. Her legs were numb. Her voice was gone. The shaft of light had become a cruel timer, marking the slow passage of endless days. Her mind became a maze. She whispered to herself. Made stories in her head. Sang songs with no words. She did not know when she began to hear the voice, whether it came from outside or inside. Whether it was real or just her dying thoughts taking shape. But on the seventh night, as the hut swallowed the last light of dusk, the voice became something more. Daughter of the forgotten, it said, low and ragged, like it had been sleeping for centuries, awaken. Amara jolted. She looked around, eyes wide, heart stuttering. There was no one there. Only dark. The shadows didn't move, but they felt heavier now. Denser. Alive. She did not answer. She curled tighter into herself and squeezed her eyes shut. Her mind screamed that it was not real. That it was starvation and madness and fear. But the voice returned the next night. And the next. It grew bolder. It began to call her by name. Began to laugh at her silence. Began to chant. And then, the shapes came. At first, they appeared at the corners of the hut, dark silhouettes within the darkness. Then clearer. A woman with a long, black face and glowing red eyes that blinked slowly like coals. A snake with iridescent feathers and the voice of a crying man. A child who beat on his chest with a sound like thunder, and when he opened his mouth, drums rolled out. Amara stared at them, her breath caught somewhere between terror and awe. They did not touch her. They did not threaten. They only watched. And whispered. They told her stories. Of gods before gods. Of the first woman who tore the sky open with her scream. Of trees that once walked. Of rivers that sang lullabies. Of spirits that had once ruled beside humans, until betrayal poisoned the soil. They said the world had been divided ever since. The human realm, the spirit realm, and the forgotten realm, that thin place in between, where abandoned powers slept. And she, Amara, was born of that place. Her mother, they told her, had once been part of their covenant. Her father, the Rainmaker, had broken it. She didn't understand. Not all at once. The information came in waves. Sometimes in chants that repeated for hours. Sometimes in songs that twisted her dreams into visions. Sometimes in riddles. The dead do not leave. They wait. Power does not die. It hides. Those who are locked away, grow. Her hunger left her. One day, she woke and realized she felt nothing. Not hunger, not thirst, not pain. Her skin, once soft and easily bruised, had grown harder. Her fingernails thickened. Her hair grew long and wild. When she touched the earth beneath her, she felt its pulse. When she hummed, the hut walls seemed to lean in. Time dissolved. Days blended into months. The light shaft above shifted ever so slightly with the seasons, but she stopped counting. Instead, she listened. And learned. They taught her chants that made the hut tremble. Songs that echoed long after her lips stopped moving. They showed her the symbols of the old ones, spirals, teeth, fire, bone, and how to draw them with her fingers. When she traced them in the dirt, the air grew colder. When she whispered them under her breath, she heard voices respond in harmony. Her body changed little. Still the frame of a girl. But her knowing grew. Her voice grew deeper. Her eyes darker. Her hands, when she stared at them, seemed to shimmer at the edges. And always, the dreams. Her mother would come to her, dressed in black, her face streaked with ash. She never embraced her. Only stood close, whispering riddles and truths half swallowed by shadows. Patience is power, she said. Vengeance is a dish that grows sweeter in silence. Sometimes, her mother would cry. Other times, she would point behind her, towards something Amara could never quite see. One night, Amara woke up weeping without knowing why. By the end of the first year, Amara no longer feared the dark. She had become part of it. The voices, once haunting, were now familiar. The snake coiled around her ankles like a pet. The drumming child sat beside her in silence. The red-eyed woman braided her hair with fingers made of smoke. She was not cursed. She was not forgotten. She was becoming. The shell the village had tried to bury her in was cracking. The old names they'd given her, witch, omen, curse, were burning away like dry leaves. In their place, new names formed. The voices began to chant them. Whisper them. Daughter of dusk. Keeper of the middle flame. Listener of roots. And every now and then, just before she slipped into sleep, she would hear the world outside. Faint. The cough of a child. The barking of a dog. The morning wail of a drum. The sound of wind rustling dead leaves. The drought still lived. The village still suffered. And the spirits still whispered. They locked you away, thinking they buried the storm. But they only gave it time to grow. Send part 3 whenever you're ready. Uluma began to breathe again, though the breath came shallow and uneven, like lungs unaccustomed to relief. After 3 years of dry skies, the first droplets fell with thunderous applause. Women wept openly in the fields. Men danced with open mouths tilted to the heavens. The parched soil drank greedily, and for a moment, the village thought itself saved. But the rain did not come alone. The first child born that rainy season was a girl. Her skin was pale, her cry oddly rhythmic, like chanting. When she opened her eyes, the midwife screamed and dropped her. They were pitch black, voids, not irises, and yet, she smiled. A wide, knowing smile. By dawn, she was dead. No sickness, no signs of struggle. Just gone, still smiling, as if she'd left willingly. The elders called it a coincidence. Then came the second child, a boy born with a cleft tongue, forked like a snake's. He hissed instead of crying, and his mother, in horror, fled into the night and was later found at the edge of the forest, muttering to herself and scratching spirals into the dirt with her fingernails. Still, the rains came. The river returned. The trees blossomed. In the village, hungry for hope, declared the drought over. The elders praised the gods for their mercy. They said the sacrifice had worked. They said the curse was lifting. They said the past should stay buried. So they buried her name too. Amara became a ghost of memory. No one mentioned her. Children were told she had been taken by spirits, but never why. Her hut, once guarded and visited by watchful eyes, was abandoned. Vultures nested on its roof. Ivy crept up the walls, choking the sacred wood. Some said the air around it shimmered strangely, like heat in a mirage. Others said the ground was too quiet there, that even ants avoided it. It became taboo. Those who walked too close came back changed, if they came back at all. A woman named Nana tried to sweep the area near the hut after a storm. She returned home with a nosebleed that wouldn't stop and died in her sleep, her fingers locked in a claw. A group of boys dared each other to touch the hut's door. Only one returned, trembling, his eyes staring past everyone as though the world had turned upside down. He spoke once, weeks later, "She sees everything." Then never again. The chief ordered the forest path to be sealed. But the forest disagreed. Trees grew in strange, twisted directions, bending toward the hut like worshippers. Birds began flying in strange patterns above the canopy, always circling. Owls stared at passers-by with human-like eyes. Some villagers claimed to hear soft singing in the dead of night, faint lullabies sung in a child's voice. Others swore they saw lights flickering in the trees, like floating embers. Then the dreams began. At first, just a few whispered of restless sleep, of wandering in a forest where all the trees bled sap like tears, where voices called from nowhere, and a girl sat on a throne of ash, smiling with fire in her eyes. But soon, nearly everyone had seen her. She never spoke. Just watched. Silent. Patient. One night, the chief's son led a hunting party deep into the woods and never came back. They found only his spear, stuck into the ground before the hut, wrapped in red cowrie shells. There was no blood. No tracks. Just the scent of burning herbs and the hush of still air. The chief, once defiant, stopped speaking in public after that. He was last seen staring into the trees, whispering prayers to a god no one knew. Wolves came next. Uluma had never seen wolves before, only jackals or the occasional wild dog. But these were wolves, black-furred, silver-eyed, and always just at the edge of vision. They watched the village without blinking, without sound. They did not attack. They simply gathered, as if waiting. The priestess said nothing. People turned inward. Festivals became muted. Drums were silenced at night. Parents clutched children tighter. Doors were barred. Fires were lit with more urgency, more prayers. Yet no one dared to speak the one thing that burned in all their throats, her name. Because deep down, they knew. The sacrifice had not erased her. It had transformed her. She had become something else. And she was close. The forest had not forgotten. The spirits that once slept now stirred. And the girl they had buried in silence, wrapped in shame and superstition, had grown. Her breath echoed in the winds. Her laughter floated in the trees. Her shadow had begun to stretch across their lives. Uluma could pretend. It could rebuild, replant, rejoice. But the drums of the old ones were beating again, faintly, beneath the soil. And the girl with fire for eyes was listening. She stepped out slowly, barefoot, her feet barely touching the earth as though gravity dared not restrain her. The door behind her, long sealed by sacred prayer, had disintegrated into ash. Not a gust of wind stirred it. The red mist parted for her as if obeying a silent command. And the girl, if one could still call her that, stood tall beneath the blood moon's glare, cloaked in its crimson light like a second skin. She had grown, but unnaturally so. Her limbs were slender but powerful, carved like the roots of ancient trees. Her skin had taken on a hue too pale to be normal, like the underside of a snake's belly, marked with faint, swirling symbols that shifted when looked at too long. Her hair, once short and wild, flowed down her back in tangled coils, interwoven with feathers, bones, and strands of silver that shimmered like captured lightning. But it was her eyes that broke the silence. They burned, not with flame, but with memory. Layered and endless, they held the grief of a child, the pain of a girl locked away, and the fury of something far older. As she looked toward the village, those who saw her from the forest's edge felt their knees buckle. One woman screamed, not from fear, but from a sudden, unbearable sorrow that pierced her chest like a blade. Another man wept openly, gasping her name, but no sound came from his throat. The air twisted around Amara. Birds fled. The wolves bowed their heads. And the forest held its breath. Inside the village, chaos bloomed. Chief Doka, once a boy raised on fear, now stood bloated with confidence and crowned in gold. His pride had only grown in Amara's absence, fattened by years of pretending he was not afraid. But when the blood moon rose, he'd known. He'd felt it in his bones. And so, with desperate defiance, he had summoned his strongest warriors, 7 men clad in red leather, their torches lit, their chants loud and trembling. They had walked into the forest, dragging the past behind them like a chain. Not one scream was heard. By the time the villagers found them at sunrise, the torches were still burning, but not with fire. They burned with silence. The spears had melted into black puddles, strangely cold to the touch. The warriors' eyes had vanished, leaving behind hollow sockets that leaked dark tears. Their mouths were sealed shut with something like wax. Some swore their hands were clutching their own hearts. The priestess, frail and forgotten, murmured, "The door has opened." And so, when the hut began to hum, just after midnight, no one was surprised. It started as a faint vibration, deep in the earth, like a drumbeat from beneath the soil. Then the trees around the hut bowed, their trunks arching in reverence, or perhaps terror. Birds fled in dark waves. The mist thickened, carrying a coppery scent that stuck to tongues and memory. Dogs howled, scratching at the dirt, their eyes rolling white. The vibration grew louder. It was no longer something heard, it was felt, in ribs and teeth and bone. One by one, the villagers left their huts, drawn toward the sound. They did not speak. They did not know why they moved. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Elders held onto walking sticks that suddenly felt far too weak. The bravest among them clutched charms and muttered half-forgotten prayers. But still, they moved toward the forest, toward the humming, toward her. When the pulse of light erupted from the hut, it illuminated the trees from within, as if every trunk and leaf glowed with inner fire. Shadows vanished. The mist boiled away. And then, silence. The humming stopped. The door creaked open. No one breathed. And from that stillness, she stepped forward. Her first step was soundless. Her second was echoed by a gust of wind that knocked over several villagers. By her third, the sky above Uluma cracked, not with thunder, but with a groan, like the heavens themselves waking from a long nightmare. She walked without looking at anyone. Not yet. Her gaze was forward, fixed on something distant, something none of them could see. Each step bent the grass beneath her, but it rose again as she passed, as if unwilling to remain crushed in her wake. At the forest's edge, she stopped. Then she turned. And the world shifted. Those who met her gaze saw things they could not explain: a burning city under a storm of birds, a woman giving birth to stars, a boy turning into ash and laughing. One man dropped to his knees and began to pray in a language he'd never learned. Another woman tore off her dress, screaming that her skin was borrowed. Children wept without knowing why. And Chief Doka? He stood at the front of the crowd, a sword in one hand, a gourd of oil in the other. He had prepared for this moment for years, convinced that the right ritual would protect him. That authority made him untouchable. He stepped forward. She looked at him. His sword fell first. Then his mouth opened, and from it poured black moths. Hundreds of them. They burst out, coating his chest, his arms, his face, until he collapsed in a heap, silent, emptied. No one helped him. Amara said nothing. But her silence was louder than any scream. Then, without a word, she walked into the village. And the village could only watch. Would you like me to continue with part 5 now? She walked into Uluma like a forgotten song remembered by the earth itself. The dust recoiled beneath her feet, replaced by fresh, green shoots that broke through the cracked soil as if rushing to greet her. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but the air around her shimmered, like heat, but colder, pulsing with energy that made even the stones quiver. Her hair, thick and wild like the mane of a night beast, flowed behind her like liquid shadow, threaded with silver streaks and tiny bones that clicked together like a warning. Her eyes, those two deep eclipses, pulled in every gaze. You could not look away, and if you did, you felt hollow, as if something sacred had slipped through your fingers. Children hid behind their mothers, then peeked out in awe. Animals, foxes, snakes, even the red-eyed crow, followed her like disciples. Spirits invisible to the common eye whispered in the wind, forming halos of flickering light behind her. Amara, once chained by fear, had returned, and every heartbeat in the village seemed to stutter in response. She passed the tree where she used to sit with her mother and pressed her fingers to its bark. It glowed for a moment, then burst into blossom despite the dry season. The petals fell around her like soft rain, and the air turned sweet with memory. The villagers didn't know what to do. Some ran. They grabbed their children and fled into their homes, slammed doors, covered windows, held charms tight to their chests. Some even dared to mutter prayers to gods who hadn't answered in years. But others fell to their knees. Old women with bones like dry twigs wept and whispered, "She has come back, but she is not the same." And they were right. When Chief Doka stumbled out from his hut, red-eyed and trembling, still shaking the moths from his skin, he did not see a girl. He saw what the village had made: a child exiled, a mind reforged, a soul rekindled in fire and shadow. But he would not back down. He could not. Pride is a sickness that does not fear death. He raised his blade. And Amara looked at him, not in hatred, not even in anger, but in knowing. She saw every word he'd said against her, every order he'd given, every lie he'd buried. She saw his dreams, his fears, his shame. "You never buried me," she said, her voice rising like a tide, deep, vast, layered like a chorus of ghosts. "You planted me." Then she exhaled, just once. Chief Doka's body went limp, and he crumpled to the ground. But he was not dead. His eyes remained open, wide and twitching, and a scream lodged silently in his throat. From that day forward, every night he closed his eyes, he awoke again in that hut, each time reliving one of Amara's 7 years. He screamed in dreams. He cried in dreams. And every morning, he awoke drenched in sweat, unable to speak. His mind unraveled thread by thread. Amara did not even glance at him again. She made no declarations of vengeance. She summoned no storm, no curse. Instead, she walked through the village like a breeze returning to a locked room. She knelt beside a sick child and placed her hand on his brow. The boy's fever vanished. A woman, wailing over her stillborn baby, looked up to see the child breathing again, coughing out the final gasp of death. A blind man, silent for years, opened his eyes and saw not only the world but his own past mistakes. Crops began to grow overnight. The dry fields turned green with stalks and maize. Wells, long dry, overflowed with water so clear it sparkled even under moonlight. Chickens laid eggs in clusters. Goats birthed twins without difficulty. The village began to sing again. But not everyone was spared. Those who had taken part in Amara's exile found themselves marked. The woman who had tied the cowrie shells around Amara's wrists awoke with vines growing out of her fingers, slowly curling up her arms. She tried to burn them, but they bled. She tried to cut them, but they whispered to her at night, calling her mother of shame. The elder who had led the ritual of sealing the hut found that his tongue had turned to ash. He opened his mouth to speak one morning, and a puff of gray dust spilled out. He clawed at his throat, but nothing remained. The silence he had forced upon Amara for 7 years now claimed him in full. One man began to dream of wolves biting his heels, night after night. Another saw his reflection smile back at him with someone else's teeth. Still, Amara offered no rage. When asked why, she simply said one word: balance. It was not revenge. It was not wrath. It was the settling of weight, the balancing of scales tipped too far for too long. Those who had sinned without consequence now paid in ways that could not be measured by scars or blood. Amara moved like wind, like smoke, like song. She sat beside crying children and told them stories of the forest, of goddesses forgotten, of moons that bled for justice. She kissed their brows and whispered truths that made them dream better dreams. Elders began to visit her quietly, placing offerings near the edge of her old hut. The hut itself, though burned, had grown anew, rebuilt by nature. Its walls were vines and bark. Its roof breathed with the rhythm of leaves. No human hand touched it. It was alive. And so the village began to shift. Some tried to go back to the way things were, but found they could not. Some left, too frightened to live in a place where the past still walked. But most stayed. Because Uluma was no longer cursed. It was awake. Would you like me to continue with part 6? In the days following Amara's return, the village began to warp under the weight of her presence. There was a shift, a quiet unrest that crawled through the cracks of the stone huts and the dirt roads. Fear, like an invisible fog, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was not a fear of her power, though that was undeniable, but of the truth she brought with her. A truth that cut deeper than any blade, and one that no one could escape. The priestess who had painted Amara with ash and led the ritual of her sealing thought she could escape the reckoning that was unfolding. She tried to run, her old bones creaking as she fled into the dense forest, thinking the forest might hide her from the goddess she had once helped to imprison. But the forest had a memory. The trees were older than any of them, older than any god the villagers had ever known. They bent toward Amara's will. They answered her call. And they knew who had abandoned their charge. The priestess didn't get far. She was found days later, stumbling at the forest's edge, her eyes wide and unseeing, her mouth moving in silent incantations. She was blind, struck down by the same forces she had helped imprison. She spoke no more of her fate, no more of the gods, but murmured words no one recognized, words from a time when the world was whole, before it was broken by fear and superstition. When Amara found her, the priestess was sitting under a tree, her hands trembling as she held an old bone charm against her chest. Her breath was shallow, but when Amara's shadow fell over her, her lips twitched into something resembling a smile. She knew her time had come, and it was not with fear that she met her end, but with acceptance. Amara knelt beside her, the forest responding to her presence. The leaves parted above them, allowing moonlight to spill down like silver threads. The priestess's hands faltered, then lifted to touch Amara's face as if seeking forgiveness, but more as though she were trying to understand the girl, the woman, who had become something else entirely. "You knew what I was," Amara said softly. Her voice was low, like the murmur of the earth itself. You knew what you had done. The priestess did not reply. She simply nodded, her fingers brushing Amara's cheek one last time before she died, her lips curving upward in a quiet, peaceful smile. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, but the smile did not bring sorrow. It brought understanding. The priestess, though flawed, had once believed she was serving a greater good. She had never expected to find herself kneeling before the very thing she had feared. Amara did not mourn. She never did. Instead, she rose and turned toward the village. It was the children who were the next to feel the pull of her return. They began to dream in vivid colors, filled with images of gods older than the world itself. Amara visited them in their sleep, revealing her truths. She appeared in their dreams like an ancient spirit, showing them rituals long forgotten, songs that had been sung by the first humans, secrets buried deep within the earth. She taught them how to listen to the wind, to hear the whispers of the gods in the rustling of leaves, in the movement of the stars. The children began to gather near the old hut, no longer a prison, but a place of power. They left offerings, flowers, stones, feathers. Sometimes, they would bring fruits from the harvest or handmade trinkets. Each child placed their gift at the entrance, a sign of their reverence. Amara allowed them to do this. But she did not let them worship her. She did not want their fear or their blind devotion. What she wanted was understanding. She wanted them to feel what had been done to her, to understand the depth of betrayal, the weight of abandonment. She wanted them to know that their actions had consequences, and that those consequences were not just physical, but spiritual. The curse was never just about her. It was about them, their inability to see the harm they had caused, the way they had abandoned the very essence of life itself. It was about the land that had suffered and the people who had forgotten their roots. Amara spent her days with the children, teaching them, guiding them, showing them the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. She showed them how to read the patterns in the clouds, how to listen to the silence of the earth, how to respect the land that had once given them everything. And in turn, the children became her voice, her messengers. They spoke of her not as a goddess to be feared, but as a force of nature, a living, breathing testament to what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. The people began to grow uneasy as they saw the children flock to the hut, their eyes bright with the fire of knowledge. They began to whisper about the girl who had returned, the one who had become more than a girl, more than a woman. They began to speak of Amara with both awe and fear, but still, none dared to confront her. They feared the reckoning that was unfolding, but they did not yet understand that the reckoning was not a punishment, it was a reminder. A reminder of their own blindness, their own complicity in the suffering they had caused. In the weeks that followed, the village began to change in subtle ways. The crops continued to flourish, the wells remained full, and the sick began to heal. But at the same time, those who had once held power, those who had called for Amara's imprisonment, felt the weight of her gaze. Their skin itched, their sleep became restless, and their minds wandered to places they did not want to revisit. Some tried to go back to their old ways, but the land itself resisted them. The soil refused to yield to their demands. The trees whispered against them. Amara did not need to do anything. She did not need to raise her voice or cast a spell. She simply existed. And that was enough. Her very presence was a reminder that the past could not be buried. It could not be forgotten. The balance, though restored in part, was still fragile, still waiting to be realized. The people would have to learn, just as the earth had learned, to heal itself. But whether they would learn in time remained to be seen. Amara's presence continued to grow, saturating the village with a quiet, potent power. The villagers, who had once feared her return, were now forced to confront the deeper story beneath the silence they had imposed upon her. No longer just a girl with a curse, Amara was becoming something more, an oracle, a bridge between the past and the present. Her teachings were subtle at first, delivered through dreams and the melodies of ancient songs. In the quiet of the night, the villagers heard her voice, soft yet resounding, weaving through their minds like a thread, pulling them toward the truth they had long denied. Through the dreamscape, Amara began to reveal the story of her birth, her family, and the gods who had shaped her fate. She showed them visions of her mother, a woman of power and grace, once a high priestess of the Forgotten Ones. These gods were older than the sky itself, older than the earth, and far more ancient than anything the villagers had ever believed. When the new gods had risen to prominence, the Forgotten Ones were cast aside, banished from the world they had once ruled. Her mother, in her wisdom, had sworn an oath to guide and protect the last of her kind, even as the world shifted away from the old ways. Her mother's love for Amara was not born of blood alone. It was a pact, a bloodline tethered to forces beyond human comprehension. In her final act of devotion, Amara's mother offered herself to the Forgotten Ones, allowing her spirit to transcend the mortal realm so that she could protect her daughter from the spirit world itself. Her body was gone, but her soul remained, woven into the fabric of Amara's very being. In the stillness of the hut, where the shadows came alive and the whispers spoke with the weight of ages, Amara's mother guided her through the torment that would shape her into something new, something powerful. The villagers, in their ignorance, had called Amara's confinement a punishment. They had believed it was a means to cleanse the land, to lift the curse that had been placed upon them. But in reality, the 7 years were not a punishment, they were a trial. A crucible of pain and power, where the girl they had once abandoned would be forged into something far greater than they could ever understand. The years spent locked away in the hut were not a burden, but a path to enlightenment. Every whisper in the darkness, every shadow that danced around her, was a lesson, a teaching from the gods who had once ruled the earth. Each night, Amara had learned to listen, to accept the lessons that had been handed down through the ages. In her dreams, Amara showed the villagers what had truly happened, how they had played a part in the tragedy that had befallen her. They had chosen cruelty, chosen to abandon her, to treat her as an outcast because they feared what they did not understand. They had convinced themselves that they were acting out of necessity, that the ritual had to be performed to save the village. But Amara made them see the truth, it had not been a necessity. It had been a choice. A choice driven by fear and superstition, by a willingness to sacrifice the innocent to preserve the status quo. As the villagers learned this truth, their reactions were mixed. Some wept for what they had done. The weight of their guilt pressed down upon them, and they felt the sting of their own hypocrisy. These were the ones who had feared Amara's return the most, the ones who had once been the loudest in their condemnation. They now saw, in their hearts, the depth of their error. The pain they had caused could not be undone, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could find redemption in understanding. Others, however, chose to flee. The revelation of their actions was too much for them to bear, and they abandoned the village in shame, unable to reconcile with the truth. It was not the truth itself that frightened them, but the consequences of facing it. Their lives, built upon lies and half-truths, could not withstand the weight of the revelation. To them, it was easier to run than to stay and bear the consequences of their choices. But there were those who listened, who remained in the village despite the weight of their guilt, and they were the ones who were changed forever. They did not run from the truth. They embraced it, as difficult as it was to bear. They understood that Amara's return was not just a reckoning for them, but a call to rebuild, to heal what had been broken. It was a challenge to face their own darkness, to recognize the harm they had caused, and to learn how to atone for it. Amara did not demand forgiveness from them, nor did she seek retribution. She was beyond such notions. Her role was not to punish, but to teach. She had been abandoned by the very people who had once claimed to care for her, but she did not seek their repentance. She sought their understanding, for that was the only path to true healing. The land would never be fully healed until the people understood the balance of their actions, the delicate harmony between the earth, the gods, and themselves. In the days that followed, the village began to change. The crops continued to grow strong, the wells remained full, and the children thrived. But there was something else at work, something intangible. A quiet shift in the hearts of those who had listened, who had truly understood the magnitude of their actions. They began to repair what they had broken, not just in the land, but within themselves. Amara's presence, once feared and misunderstood, became a beacon of transformation. No longer a symbol of vengeance, she became a teacher, a guide who helped the villagers confront the darkness within their own hearts. Through her, they learned that the greatest curse was not the drought, not the suffering they had endured, but the blindness that had kept them from seeing their own complicity. And it was through acknowledging that blindness that they could begin to heal. And so, the village of Uluma began to rebuild, not just with crops and animals, but with understanding. They learned that the power of the gods was not something to be feared, but something to be respected. They learned that balance could only be restored when the truth was accepted, no matter how painful it might be. And they learned that Amara, the girl they had once locked away, was not their enemy, but their teacher. The old hut, once a place of imprisonment, became a shrine, a symbol of the truth that had been hidden in the shadows. The villagers no longer feared the forest or the gods. They no longer feared the darkness. Instead, they learned to walk within it, to understand it, and to find the light that lay hidden beneath. In time, they would come to understand that the greatest lesson of all was not the wrath of the gods, but the power of redemption and the strength to face the truth, no matter the cost. Amara's final act before leaving Uluma was one of quiet, profound power. As the sun began its ascent over the village, casting long shadows and golden light across the fields, she stood tall, her presence commanding and serene. Her skin gleamed like polished obsidian, catching the morning rays in a way that made it appear as if she was part of the very earth itself. Her eyes, those haunting eclipses, surveyed the villagers who had gathered before her, both fearful and reverent. She was no longer the girl they had locked away, no longer the child they had abandoned. She was something else now, something ancient, timeless, and beyond their comprehension. "I forgive none of you," she said, her voice calm, yet carrying the weight of everything she had endured. The words were not a threat, nor were they a declaration of vengeance. They were simply the truth. She had no need for forgiveness, and her power did not come from pity or compassion. It came from something deeper, something more primal. "But I release you," she continued, her tone unwavering. It was not a gesture of mercy, but of finality. She had done what she had come to do. The village would live or die by the choices they made now. With those words, Amara turned and walked away from the village, her bare feet making no sound as they pressed against the earth. The villagers watched, rooted to the spot, as she made her way toward the forest. The trees, once standing silent and unmoving, seemed to bow and part in her presence, as if the very land itself was acknowledging her passage. Light followed her, dappling the ground in golden rays as though the sun had chosen to bend to her will. The birds sang her name in tongues that had not been spoken by humans for generations, their melodies reverberating through the air, carrying with them an echo of something long forgotten. As Amara disappeared into the forest, the villagers knew that she was gone, not in the way of the dead, but in the way of something eternal. The forest, which had always been alive with its secrets, swallowed her whole. Yet even as she vanished into the depths of the trees, the villagers felt that she was never truly gone. Her presence lingered, woven into the very fabric of the land. It was as if she had become one with the forest, a part of its spirit, forever entwined with the power of the earth itself. In the years that followed, the stories of Amara's return became legends, whispered from one generation to the next. Travelers passing through the region would often tell of a spirit woman who wandered the countryside, healing villages and offering guidance to those in need. She was said to appear on the wind, her form shimmering like a mirage, her voice a soft murmur that spoke directly to the hearts of the pure and the innocent. Some claimed that she could cure the sick with a single touch, while others swore that she would curse anyone who dared to harm the defenseless. But there were also darker tales, of those who had wronged her or the people she protected. It was said that Amara would never forget those who had betrayed her, and that she would find them, no matter where they hid. The curse she had placed upon the village was not just a punishment, but a promise. Those who sought to do harm would one day face her wrath, no matter how far they traveled. Despite the fear some had of her power, there was an undeniable reverence that surrounded her name. Her hut, once a place of imprisonment and torment, remained untouched by time. Vines grew wild around it, creeping over the walls, but never completely overtaking it. The structure stood as a monument, a place of silence, of memory, of power that transcended the mortal world. No one dared to enter, for they knew that it was not just a hut, it was a symbol of Amara's legacy, her transformation from a helpless child to a being of unimaginable strength. And so, the years passed, and the village of Uluma slowly healed. It was not the same village that had once abandoned Amara, but a place changed by her presence, even in her absence. The crops flourished, the wells remained full, and the villagers lived in harmony with the land. They no longer feared the gods or the forest. They no longer feared the darkness. They had learned, through the suffering they had caused and the lessons they had been forced to confront, that true power came not from domination, but from understanding and balance. Amara's name became a prayer. When the people needed guidance, they would whisper her name into the wind, and some said they could feel her presence in the breeze that rustled through the trees. She was a spirit now, not bound by the constraints of time, but free to roam the world in whatever form she chose. In the villages surrounding Uluma, the children sang songs that echoed through the night, their voices carrying the memory of Amara's story across the generations. The song, simple yet profound, became a ritual, a way to remember the girl who had become a legend, a woman who had risen from the ashes of her torment to become a force of nature itself. She went in crying, came out flame. She speaks no lies, she knows your name. The song was a reminder of the power that lay in the truth, in understanding, in confronting the darkness within oneself. It was a song of redemption, of transformation, of the unyielding spirit that had once been trapped and cast aside, only to return as something greater than anyone could have imagined. As the years turned into decades, the villagers of Uluma continued to live their lives, never forgetting the lesson they had learned from Amara. They understood that the world was not simply black and white, good and evil, but a complex tapestry of choices, consequences, and redemption. Amara's return had taught them that the greatest power lay not in fear or domination, but in the quiet strength of those who were willing to face the truth, no matter the cost. And so, the village prospered, its people at peace with the land and with each other. The memory of Amara, the girl who had been locked away for 7 years, would never fade. For she had not only changed the course of their history, but she had become a symbol of something eternal, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of rebirth.